Should Trump's government be buying Intel stock? Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. The Trump administration is taking a 9.9% equity position in Intel stock. As all of you have heard, it is reportedly making an $8.9 billion investment in Intel common stock, fueled by the remaining $5.7 billion in grants previously awarded but not yet paid to Intel under the U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, along with the $3.2 billion awarded to the company as part of the Secure Enclave program. For that, instead of simply granting the money to Intel, the government will get this 9.9% interest in Intel stock. That comes on top of the Trump administration's golden share in U.S. Steel, an arrangement that gives its major governance and voting rights as part of its approval of the Nippon Steel acquisition of U.S. Steel. So wait, isn't that an abrogation of the whole laissez-faire philosophy of America? Believe you me, it has definitely induced some hand-wringing. Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute, invoked George Orwell, saying, "We are going past 1984 into Animal Farm territory at this point." The Right of Center Manhattan Institute's Daniel DiMartino predicted cronyism, with the result that, quote, taxpayers will lose billions, end quote. Conservative talk show host Eric Erickson called it socialism, protesting, quote, "You can't just be against socialism when the left does it," end quote. Well, whether you view this Intel transaction as a good thing or a bad thing, in its historical lack of stock ownership, the United States is the exception among major world governments. Let's take a look. As you know, we at Tycos follow most closely the Big Seven, the seven largest economies in the world that together constitute 63% of world GDP. With the exception of the United States and the United Kingdom, they all own a lot of company stocks. China does, of course, in an amount equal to 58% of its GDP, or about $10 trillion worth of stock. That's a lot of stock and includes ownership of most of the biggest banks and corporations. But they're a communist country, and the people, or read, the government, are supposed to own everything. But look at France and Germany, which both own an amount of stock over 20% of their GDPs, or about $800 billion and $1 trillion respectively. That's a lot of stock for a Western democracy to own. Japan's government owns stock equal to 15% of its GDP, but it hasn't stopped there. Alone among these Big Seven countries, its central bank, the Bank of Japan, also has a huge position in stocks, equal to another 12% of its GDP. So taken together, its stock ownership is second behind only China and is approaching 30% of its GDP. Even India's government owns stocks worth almost 10% of its GDP. In stark contrast, the US and UK are pretty much at zero. In the UK's case, that's the legacy of the Iron Lady herself, Margaret Thatcher, who championed the privatization of its industries in the late 1970s and 1980s. And the US never got there to begin with, in my view, due to the relative power of its business community from the very onset of the country. Even its first central bank, the Bank of the United States, chartered way back in 1791, was largely privately owned from inception. So why do the governments of these other countries own so much stock? In the case of France and Germany, it's their socialist legacy. The French state has a legacy of maintaining control in key sectors like defense, nuclear energy, and transportation to ensure national interests are protected. It holds stakes in public services like EDF in the energy sector and Orange in telecommunications to ensure accessibility and affordability for the public. It also makes broad use of a golden share program itself, whereby it purchases a single share in domestic companies to obtain veto power over certain corporate decisions, especially acquisitions. Of course, this is all the legacy of widespread nationalization in post-World War II to rebuild its industrial base. Even when privatizations came into vogue in the 1980s, France retained significant minority stakes in formerly nationalized companies. Other examples of its equity stakes include Airbus, Air France, and Renault. The story is similar in Germany. For example, Germany's national railway company, Deutsche Bahn AG, is fully owned by the state. Some of its ownership has come from crisis. The government acquired a 25% stake in Commerzbank in 2009 during the global financial crisis, and it still has a 12% stake. Hypo Real Estate was nationalized in 2009 by a government stabilization fund to restore stability to the housing market. During a 2022 energy crisis, Germany nationalized the energy company Uniper to prevent its collapse, securing the nation's energy supply. The German government owns stakes in some companies to protect against foreign takeover and support national industry, including Deutsche Telekom and Volkswagen. The Indian government owns a significant amount of stock from nation building after independence. In the 1950s, India's business sector simply lacked the capital needed. The government stepped in to launch large-scale industrialization efforts in key sectors like steel, coal, and heavy machinery. A major wave of nationalization occurred in 1969 and again in 1980 when the government took control of major private banks with the goal of expanding banking services into rural areas and direct credit towards agriculture and small businesses. Note that this is changing, and the current policy aims to minimize the government's presence in, quote, non-strategic sectors of the economy. But why does Japan's government and its central bank together own so much stock? A big part of it is its multi-decade effort to prop up its economy after its colossal collapse in the 1990s. Action taken to combat deflation and stimulate its economy. Remember that from 1998 to 2016, Japan's nominal GDP did not increase at all. That's an astonishing fact. And their struggles here were compounded by the West's global financial crisis of 2008. The most significant driver of the government's stock ownership in Japan has been the Bank of Japan's long-term program of purchasing exchange-traded funds. Starting in 2010, the BOJ began buying trillions of yen worth of ETFs as an unconventional form of quantitative easing to combat its years of economic stagnation and deflation. Its aim was absolutely interventionist. It wanted to increase stock prices, encourage companies to expand, and prompt Japanese savers to shift from conservative savings towards riskier, high-return assets like stocks. The result was that by 2020, the Bank of Japan had become the largest shareholder of many major Japanese companies. The BOJ's holdings grew so large that some estimated it owned approximately 7% of the entire Tokyo Stock Exchange market cap. It now faces the almost impossible challenge of unwinding its massive holdings without disrupting the market. In addition, the Japanese National Pension Fund, the GPIF, is the largest single pool of retirement savings in the world, with over $1.7 trillion in assets under management. In 2020, that fund adopted a policy of holding roughly 25% domestic equities and 25% international equities. So it has been buying stocks to reach that goal, making the GPIF a major force in global stock markets. So given all this, the Trump administration's actions don't really look out of line, and perhaps may even appear a little puny in comparison. But the question remains, should many of these countries own stock? The political temptation for a government to prop up its stock market or rescue a company or industry may simply be too great, especially in an increasingly nationalistic world where governments are more overtly abetting the market share goals of its key industries or companies, such as in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and supercomputing. I tend to think there are legitimate strategic reasons for that, but in the end, less is more. If nothing else, too much ownership here is a trap. Governments can get stuck with these stocks with no non-disruptive way to exit. So better to tread lightly and selectively and carefully. It's easy for governments to buy stocks, easy for them to maintain ownership, and very, very difficult for them to reverse that ownership without disrupting or decimating markets. Nevertheless, whether they should own equities or not, my prediction is they will, and I also predict that more of their central banks will as well over time. The massive financialization of the world, which has meant that there is trillions of more money sloshing around in the world, coupled with the increasingly existential business competition among nations, may make it inevitable that governments will act much more assertively in markets. Thanks. That's it for this week.